The clinking of cutlery was the only sound filling the silence between them, heavy and awkward. Georgia had spent the better part of the afternoon preparing his favorite dishes, hoping tonight might bring even a hint of the connection they once had. She carefully watched Aryan across the table, searching his face for something, anything, that would let her know he still cared. But he barely looked up, his gaze fixed on his plate as he picked at the food, barely eating. "Is something wrong?" she finally asked, trying to keep her voice light. She wanted to reach across the table, to somehow bridge the chasm that had slowly formed between them. But Aryan simply sighed an exasperated, tired sound. "It's fine, Georgia," he said, sounding like he wished he were anywhere but there. When he pushed the plate aside, his food untouched, she felt her heart sink. "Did you not like it?" she asked, hoping it was something as simple as his mood, or maybe just a bad day at work. But Aryan didn't meet her gaze. "I didn't ask for this, Georgia. This whole setup. Us," he waved his hand in the air, his voice filled with a coldness that stung. "I'm not interested in playing house. You knew what you were getting into, didn't you?" Georgia felt the weight of his words crash over her, the harsh tone of his voice filling the room and leaving her feeling hollow. She struggled to hold back tears, forcing herself to stay composed. But inside, her heart felt like it was shattering, piece by piece. Without waiting for a response, Aryan rose from his seat and headed toward the door. "I'm going out," he said, barely glancing back at her. And then he was gone, leaving the door closing softly behind him, a small, quiet sound that still echoed in Georgia's heart like a thunderclap. Georgia sat at the table, staring at the untouched plates, feeling numb. This wasn't the first time she had found herself alone at a table set for two. In fact, this was how things had been from almost the very start of their marriage. It had been one small disappointment after another, a gradual erosion of the life she'd imagined. She remembered the early days, how she had cooked, decorated, and filled their home with warmth, hoping he would eventually feel the same joy she felt in building a life together. But Aryan had never really engaged. He would come home late, avoid conversation, and pull away from her attempts to bring them closer. From the beginning, Georgia had tried to be patient, believing it was just a rough transition. But Aryan had never let her in, and every rejection felt like another nail in the coffin of the love she had hoped they could share. His words tonight cut even deeper, as they echoed what she had feared from the start, that he never wanted any of this, and she had been trying to hold on to a dream he'd never shared. Sitting in the empty room, Georgia felt the weight of reality settle over her like a shadow. She had given him everything she could, but he had closed off his heart long before she ever had a chance to reach it. Georgia's mind drifted back to their wedding day, a day filled with joy and hope, when she had believed they were beginning a life of love and partnership. Now, that promise felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the coldness that had settled between them. Georgia took a deep breath, barely able to contain the happiness that filled her heart. Today was the day. She stood in front of the mirror in her bridal suite, adjusting the intricate folds of her dress, admiring the way it sparkled under the soft lights. She couldn't help but smile, her cheeks warm with excitement as she thought about the day's significance. Marrying her childhood friend, someone who had shared her laughter, her secrets, her dreams, felt like a fairy tale come true. As she glanced around, the familiar faces of her family surrounded her, their pride and joy matching her own. She felt the love in their smiles, in the way her mother adjusted her veil, in the gentle squeeze of her father's hand. There was something magical in this reunion of the past and future, all coming together in a single, unforgettable moment. She thought back to their childhood, to the days when they had run barefoot through the fields, chasing each other, sharing stories of what they would be when they grew up. He had been her closest friend, her confidant. And now, here they were, about to start a new chapter together. It felt destined, like the culmination of something that had always been meant to be. The ceremony began, and as she walked down the aisle, her heart beat with hope. She looked up at him, waiting at the altar, and for a brief second, everything else faded away. She saw only him, the friend she'd known for so long and now her partner in life. She imagined the future unfolding before them, a home filled with laughter, shared dreams, and countless memories waiting to be created. In that moment, she felt a joy that was boundless. Georgia whispered a silent promise to herself: she would make this marriage her own. She would love him fiercely, support him, and build a life with him that they both deserved. As they exchanged vows, her voice was steady, filled with conviction. She had no doubt that this was the beginning of a beautiful journey together, one where the bonds of friendship and love would see them through anything. And when the day finally drew to a close, Georgia felt a deep sense of contentment. As they stood together, watching the last of the guests depart, she felt certain that they had a lifetime of happiness ahead. In the early days of their marriage, Georgia felt like she was living in a dream. The excitement of finally being married to Aryan, her childhood friend, filled her with boundless hope. She saw her life stretching out before her, a beautiful path they would walk together, hand in hand. Every morning, she would wake up with a smile, eager to fill their days with memories. The thought of creating a home with Aryan, one full of laughter, warmth, and shared dreams, was everything she had ever wanted. She poured herself into building this life, adding small touches around their home that she thought would make it more special: a favorite photograph of theirs on the shelf, cozy blankets for late nights, and fresh flowers on the table. She was attentive, learning his routines, anticipating his needs, and taking joy in the smallest details of their life together. In those early days, she believed her love and care would be enough to bring them closer, trusting that time and patience would deepen their bond. Whenever she caught Aryan in a rare, unguarded moment, like when he laughed at an old inside joke or smiled faintly in response to her efforts, she took it as a sign that they were on the right track. She convinced herself that his quietness was just a sign of adjustment, not reluctance. She was prepared to be patient, to work through whatever challenges came their way, because she believed in the foundation of their friendship and love. But even as she invested everything into their marriage, a small part of her was troubled by his distant moments and the barriers he seemed to put up. She brushed them aside at first, believing they'd fade with time. Yet, despite her best efforts, that warmth she had imagined in their future together remained elusive, leaving Georgia with an uneasy feeling she couldn't shake. Still, in those early days, she held on tightly to her dreams, hoping that her love alone could carry them through. Then, she started slowly thinking about how Aryan ignored her in all the situations. One evening, Georgia organized a small gathering at their home, inviting a few close family members to celebrate Aryan's recent promotion. She went out of her way to make it special, decorating the living room and preparing his favorite dishes, hoping he would appreciate her efforts and that they'd share a moment of pride together. The evening began warmly, with laughter and conversation filling their home. But as guests congratulated him, Aryan barely acknowledged Georgia, brushing past her with a dismissive smile whenever she tried to join the conversation. At one point, she lightly placed her hand on his arm, eager to feel a connection, to remind him that she was there, proud of him and happy for this success. But Aryan shifted his arm away and responded to someone else's question without even glancing her way. It was as though she were invisible, an outsider in her own home. In that moment, Georgia felt a profound sadness that went beyond just disappointment. It was the kind of hurt that cuts deep because it combines longing with a sharp sense of rejection. Here she was, standing in the very home she'd worked so hard to fill with warmth, surrounded by people celebrating the man she loved, yet feeling completely alone. It was as though her efforts and feelings had disappeared in plain sight, as if she were somehow both present and unseen. When Aryan brushed past her with that dismissive smile, it likely felt like a tiny crack in her heart, a reminder that her love and pride for him went unnoticed. As she tried to reach out by touching his arm, hoping for even a small gesture in return, his subtle rejection struck her deeply, like a painful confirmation that her presence and support didn't matter to him in that moment. The sadness Georgia felt wasn't just about being overlooked in a single evening. It was layered, mixed with confusion, hurt, and even self-doubt, leading her to question whether her role in his life, and in their relationship, was truly valued. As laughter filled the room around her, she forced herself to keep smiling, all the while feeling a growing ache in her chest, a tightening that comes when love and effort are left unreciprocated. She stood there, looking at Aryan and their guests, yet feeling as if she were fading into the background, invisible and unimportant, in the celebration she had so carefully crafted for him. A few weeks later, Georgia fell ill with a bad fever. She was physically weak, and the solitude of lying in bed all day was a stark contrast to the closeness she had hoped for in marriage. When Aryan finally came home, she mustered her strength and asked if he could sit with her, hoping for even a small moment of comfort. But Aryan's response was curt. "I've had a long day, Georgia. I'm really not in the mood to play nurse," he said, barely glancing at her as he set down his keys and walked into the other room. Georgia felt a deep ache, one that went beyond the physical fever. Lying there, weakened and vulnerable, she had gathered all the energy she had left, not just to speak but to reach out, hoping Aryan might offer her a small gesture of care, a little kindness. She wasn't asking for much, just a moment of companionship in her illness, a reminder that he was there, that she wasn't alone. But instead of the comfort she so desperately craved, she was met with an unfeeling response, as if her pain and need were an inconvenience, something he neither had time nor patience for. Aryan's words felt like a cold rejection, piercing through her fragile state, intensifying her loneliness. His dismissiveness turned her already small request into a source of shame, as though needing him, wanting his presence, was too much to ask. The home they shared felt suddenly unfamiliar, stripped of warmth, and she felt stranded, isolated by both her physical ailment and the emotional distance that seemed to be growing between them. As he walked into the other room without a second glance, it became painfully clear that the companionship she longed for in marriage might not be reciprocated. Georgia was left there, wrapped in the weight of her own sadness, feeling unseen, unloved, and wondering if her yearning for closeness and support was destined to go unanswered. This small moment became a heavy reminder that, in her times of need, she was ultimately on her own. Georgia had always sensed something lingering between them, a certain distance she couldn't quite name. But when she finally stumbled upon Aryan's past, it was as if every unexplained moment, every cold silence, and every dismissive look snapped into painful clarity. It was a quiet conversation between Aryan and an old friend one evening that revealed the truth, their voices drifting from the next room. Georgia stood frozen in place as she overheard fragments, mentions of another woman, a love that had been cut short by tragedy, and the heavy sorrow Aryan still carried. A woman he had loved deeply, a woman he had lost and never truly let go. At that moment, Georgia felt her heart shatter. It was as if the ground she stood on had suddenly crumbled beneath her, pulling her into a painful reality she had been unknowingly living in. She realized, with an ache that reached her core, that she had been living in someone else's shadow, investing all of herself into a marriage he had never fully committed to. It was devastating, an overwhelming blend of betrayal and heartbreak. She felt like a stranger in her own life, realizing that the love she thought was hers had been quietly reserved for someone who no longer existed, someone she could never compete with. Processing this truth was an agonizing struggle. Georgia felt deceived, as though the life and love she'd built had been based on an illusion, on Aryan's silent unwillingness to let go of a past that still held him captive. She wanted to be understanding, to recognize the depth of his grief, but the hurt and betrayal twisted in her chest. How could she reconcile her own pain with his lingering sorrow? How could she continue in a marriage that she now knew he had entered out of necessity, not love? The weight of this revelation settled heavily on her, pressing down on her heart. She was haunted by questions that had no answers, by dreams she had nurtured with him that now felt hollow. She could hardly breathe under the weight of her emotions, feeling as though she were losing herself. Standing there, alone with this unbearable truth, Georgia felt not only the loss of Aryan's love but of her own trust, her own sense of worth, and the life she thought they were building together. It was the deepest form of loneliness, to be in love with someone who had never truly been hers to begin with. Georgia's marriage, once filled with hope, had become an emotional weight that she carried daily. Every attempt she made to connect, every effort to reach through the invisible wall between them, was met with silence or indifference. It was as if Aryan's heart was an unyielding door locked shut, the key lost in a past he could never fully leave behind. And no matter how much love and patience she offered, that barrier only grew stronger, widening the chasm between them until she felt like a stranger within her own home. Over time, Georgia felt trapped, torn between compassion for his unresolved grief and the undeniable pain of being in a relationship devoid of intimacy. She tried everything she could to support him, quietly staying by his side, offering gentle comfort in his hard moments, hoping he'd one day open up. But his grief remained a shadow over their lives, leaving no space for her, no room for the love she longed to give. She felt as if she were standing in a dark, endless hallway, her voice echoing against walls that never returned her call. As the days turned into months, the toll on Georgia became unbearable. Her self-worth, once vibrant and sure, began to wither under the weight of his emotional absence. She felt invisible, reduced to a presence he tolerated rather than cherished. Her health began to decline, drained by the constant ache of feeling unloved and unvalued. Every attempt she made to nurture herself, to find solace, seemed futile in the shadow of a marriage that offered her nothing in return. Georgia found herself trapped between two agonizing choices: to stay in this loveless marriage, forever hoping he might someday love her in return, or to leave and finally seek the freedom and self-respect that had slipped away in her pursuit of his affection. It was a painful, silent struggle that left her exhausted, caught between love and self-preservation, wondering if she had lost herself entirely in the process. Georgia's physical and emotional health had deteriorated to such an extent that she was constantly exhausted, her body as worn as her spirit. Friends and family grew concerned, urging her to see a doctor, and eventually, she relented. Her doctor listened intently as she described her symptoms: the fatigue, the aching heaviness in her chest, the constant sense of loneliness, and his concern was clear. Gently, he advised her to prioritize her own well-being, emphasizing that no relationship was worth sacrificing her health for. He recommended therapy, urging her to start finding the strength to care for herself. Reluctantly, Georgia began attending sessions with Dr. Ethan, a therapist known for his warm demeanor and quiet confidence. She noticed his handsome features the first time she met him, kind eyes that seemed to see right through her guarded exterior, and a calming smile that somehow softened her anxieties. Unlike anyone else she'd confided in, Dr. Ethan listened to her without judgment, his voice always steady, encouraging her to explore the pain she'd kept locked away for so long. In each session, she found herself slowly unraveling the layers of hurt, of disappointment, and of the emotional emptiness that had left her feeling weak and invisible. With Dr. Ethan's support, she began to see that she deserved more than just the scraps of affection she'd been clinging to. His presence offered a kind of stability she hadn't felt in ages, a reminder that compassion, warmth, and attentiveness were not just ideals, but things she could experience and, perhaps, expect. With time, Georgia started feeling glimmers of strength return. She began taking small steps to reclaim her health, both physically and emotionally, and each session with Dr. Ethan left her feeling a little less broken, a little more whole. The doctor-patient boundaries were clear, yet she couldn't help but notice the comfort his presence brought her, a comforting sense that someone truly saw her, cared about her, and believed she deserved happiness and peace. One evening, after another strained day spent in the silence of her own home, Georgia sat alone, feeling the weight of every sacrifice she had made. She thought about the years she had given to a marriage that had taken so much from her without giving anything back. For months, she had tried to convince herself that things might change, that her love alone could bridge the gap between her and Aryan. But as she looked at her reflection, tired and pale, Georgia felt a sudden, undeniable clarity wash over her. She asked herself a single question: why am I still here? The answer wasn't easy, but it was there: fear, habit, the hope that love might finally be reciprocated. She had once believed that marriage meant enduring everything for the person she loved. But now she saw that, in holding on to him, she had slowly lost herself. Georgia knew she was educated, capable, and that she came from a supportive family who had always encouraged her independence. She could get a job anywhere, rebuild her life, and find happiness beyond this loveless union. The realization was both liberating and frightening. At first, Georgia hesitated, haunted by guilt and the thought of what others might say. Divorce wasn't something she had ever imagined for herself, and she questioned whether she was strong enough to break free. But her therapy sessions had given her a glimpse of what life could look like when she chose herself. Dr. Ethan had helped her see that she had the right to prioritize her well-being, to live a life where she wasn't weighed down by loneliness and constant disappointment. Slowly, her resolve grew. Georgia understood that this decision marked a significant turning point, one that could lead her back to a life where she felt whole and worthy again. Though the path ahead was uncertain, she felt a new strength and a sense of hope in choosing herself, and in doing so, she took her first brave steps toward freedom. When Georgia finally gathered the courage to confront Aryan about the divorce, she had braced herself for a difficult, emotional conversation, maybe even a small plea or a trace of regret. Somewhere deep down, a part of her still hoped he would pause, that he might ask her to reconsider, or at least acknowledge the life they had shared. But Aryan barely reacted. He listened quietly, took a deep breath, and after a brief, silent pause, he simply nodded and signed the papers without hesitation. The swiftness, the ease with which he agreed, left Georgia feeling hollow. She had spent so long carrying the burden of their marriage, fighting alone for something that, in the end, he was so willing to let go of. The emptiness hit her like a wave, a profound sadness mixed with a strange relief. It was as if his quick acceptance confirmed what she had feared all along, that her love and efforts had never truly mattered to him. In that moment, Georgia felt an odd combination of betrayal and freedom. It was heartbreaking to see her years of effort dismissed so casually, yet freeing to finally see the truth laid bare. She realized that, despite the pain of his indifference, she was no longer trapped by it. Her fight was over, and with the papers signed, she could finally start healing. She walked away feeling lighter, even if her heart still ached, knowing she had finally chosen herself over a love that had never been hers to keep. After the divorce, Georgia found herself standing at the threshold of an entirely new life, one where she was finally free to choose herself. At first, the quietness felt strange, like a reminder of all she had lost. But as the days turned into weeks, she started to see the quiet as a blessing, a space where she could begin to heal and rediscover her own voice. She continued her therapy sessions with Dr. Ethan, where each meeting became a small victory in her journey back to self-love. Through his gentle guidance, she learned to release the guilt and sadness that had weighed her down, replacing it with compassion for herself. Slowly, Georgia began to remember the dreams and passions she had set aside, the confidence she once had in her abilities. Therapy helped her realize she was more than just a role in someone else's life, she was a whole, resilient person deserving of love and happiness. Georgia invested time in rediscovering what made her feel alive. She began taking walks in the mornings, breathing in the fresh air and letting herself feel present. She picked up hobbies she had once loved, started journaling, and even enrolled in a painting class, enjoying the simple pleasure of creating something for herself. The more she focused on nurturing herself, the more she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Over time, Georgia's reflection in the mirror changed. She saw strength, hope, and a quiet confidence that had been hidden for so long. She was learning to love herself, flaws and all, finding happiness in the small moments and trust in her own journey. Though the pain of her past still lingered, she now knew it didn't define her. Georgia was not just healing, she was growing, stepping into a future shaped by her own choices, filled with a sense of freedom and hope that she had almost forgotten was possible.
After the divorce, Aryan found himself surrounded by an unexpected quiet. The space that had once been filled with Georgia's laughter, her thoughtful gestures, and her quiet presence now felt hollow, a constant reminder of what he had lost. In the solitude, he began to feel the weight of his own actions, or rather, his lack of them. The indifference he had shown, the emotional walls he had built, and the way he had brushed aside her every attempt to connect, all of it came rushing back to him as painful memories that wouldn't fade. At first, Aryan told himself that Georgia was better off, that maybe the divorce was what they both needed. But as the days wore on, a different, heavier truth settled in: he missed her. He missed the warmth she brought into his life, the small ways she tried to support him even when he pushed her away, and her gentle touch that he had taken for granted. Now, in the silence of his empty home, he realized how much he had ignored and neglected her, and how her love had been a gift he never truly appreciated. Aryan felt a profound regret, a gnawing guilt for how he had treated her and for the way he had let his unresolved grief blind him to the woman who stood by him. He recognized now how hard she had tried to bridge the gap between them, to be his partner in a marriage he had barely shown up for. And while he missed her deeply, he knew he had no right to ask her to stay, to come back to the love he had all but extinguished with his silence. Repentant, Aryan found himself reflecting on the ways he had failed her. He understood now that his unresolved past had not only trapped him in grief but had also stolen Georgia's happiness. She had given him everything, and he had given her nothing in return. In his heart, Aryan knew he had lost more than just a marriage, he had lost the chance to be with someone who loved him unconditionally. He carried the regret heavily, realizing that no matter how much he missed her, Georgia deserved a life filled with love and appreciation, something he had been unable to give. And as painful as it was, he accepted that he had no right to expect forgiveness or a second chance.